Chapter 22. Tommy didn't sleep last night. He had stayed awake all night, working on Ronbu's plastic folder of Greek myths, trying to get through all of them. His hope for finding one that just fit, that made sense, wilted every time he drew a red cross over another myth related to Zeus's escapades with various women. He didn't realize the full capacity and variety of myths and tragedies until now. He focused solely onto those fact files because he knew that the second his mind wandered, it would be about Wilbur. He didn't want to cry again, or be reminded of the man who both gave him a childhood and took away his youth. It was complicated. It was even complicated before when he found out that Wilbur was reincarnated but didn't remember. But now, with those memories returning, there was a chance his brother would come back. No matter the drunken promises Wilbur whispered to him, that he'd never hurt Tommy like he did, it scared him. More than he wanted to admit. As the light shined in his room, alerting Tommy that it was the morning, he packed up the plastic folder. He threw the sheets he deemed as irrelevant to him into his bedside drawers. Maybe it was for the best that he didn't sleep. Dream couldn't visit him this way. When he sat at the breakfast table, the fog in his head, the cloudiness that sheltered him from the parts of him that flinched and begged for Wilbur to stop reaching over the table, having his hands near him, grew. He liked it this way, not being coherent and fully there. It separated him from having to deal with these thoughts, the memories that the mere presence of Wilbur brought along, that were wrapped in barbed wire and smothering him. He was fine. Completely in control and fine. Tommy walked to school as Wilbur felt too hungover to attend today, which he was thankful for. The day ended fast. He didn't realize it was the second to last day before Easter break, until Ronbu told him when the two of them were in the library after school hours. Tommy continued his rummaging through the myth fact files with his notebook, separating the myths that didn't apply to him. So far, he had crossed out Circe, Cassandra, Pandora, and Sisyphus. He blinked down at the next sheet of paper he picked up. His heart beat faster. The myth of Medusa laid in his hands. As he read it, flashes of that dreaded dream visit flickered. Estella's cries rattled his ears. The library walls looked too similar to that apartment. His brother screamed out Medusa's name in that dark room as he stabbed himself in the heart, knowing the myth was incorrect. Those were memories Wilbur was going to remember. He took 270 lives that day. Wilbur had transparent blood on his hands that would seep red when the memories came back. Would Wilbur still be Wilbur when he remembered? Or just like the ship of Theseus, would he be rewritten, replaced by the same man that kept Tommy up at night? He didn't want to know. Someone touched his shoulder, too close to his neck. The pressure similar to that time Tommy was pinned to a ravine wall. Rough hands clasped around his neck, strangling him to the point where his begging died on his blue lips. His feet dangled helplessly, kicking at the man, his brother, who held him in place. Tommy, it's me," a voice said. He recognized it. But the squeaking of bats in that cave, the creaking of the stone walls, and his brother's cackling and ramblings drowned it out. "Calm down, it's just me." His eyes fluttered open. His eyelashes stuck together. The light of the room stung. He crumbled over, coughing. A breath lodged in his throat pierced his chest. He tried to ease his breathing as the weight around his neck released. It was Ronbu calling his name. Not his brother. Not the soul stuck inside of Wilbur waiting to be remembered. He regained his breath as he calmed himself down. The soft phrases Ronbu muttered anchored him. Gray eyes drenched in concern and fear squinted at him. I'm fine, he croaked out, his hand still clutching at his chest. You don't have to lie to me, Tommy, Ranbu said, quietly. But I already am. He shook his head at him, the ringing in his ears amplified. Ranbu made a noise of confusion. I haven't told you everything about my curse or with my brother. You don't have to if you don't want to. Ranbu interrupted. All I need to know is the bare minimum to help you. But... Ranbu's hand hovered over his. He glanced at him, as if asking for permission. He nodded, and Ranbu held it carefully, the warmth of Ranbu's clashing with the coldness of his own. I won't force you to explain yourself to me, his friend said. Ranbu squeezed his hand. Ever. What if I want to? He blurted out before he could stop himself. What if I want to? Ranbu grabbed his other hand and held them both together. Then you can, in your own time. With the fondness in Ranbu's top part of his face, the comforting grip he had Tommy in, and the honesty in his words, Tommy felt as if he could tell Ranbu anything at this moment. He could let out the thoughts that had been pestering him ever since last night. He exhaled heavily, preparing himself. Wilbur is W-Cert, but he doesn't remember. Ranbu frowned, his eyes wide and confused. And he's beginning to... He cut himself off. He couldn't stomach the next words. He's remembering. Tears swelled in his eyes, blurring his vision. He told me he remembered hurting me in that fucking ravine. A whine left his throat. The fog in his head thinned. The cloudiness blew away. His feet kicked at the ravine wall, trying to push his brother away from him, as his face turned blue. He hated that day. He just wanted to mess around for once, release some stress, and behave like a kid again. He arranged items in his brother's chests, moved them into different places, and that annoyed him so much. Tommy didn't know his brother would be that mad. I can't do this. He shook Ranbu's hands off him. I can't. The ravine remained silent for once, as Tommy, with the little oxygen he had, called out for his father to come to save him. To rescue him, full well knowing that he was across the country doing fuck all as his two sons sacrificed their lives for a losing war. But his screams didn't stop his brother from shoving Tommy into a man-made cave and boarding it up as a punishment. He punched at those walls for hours, until his fists painted the stone red, to no avail. He could vaguely hear Ranbu calling out his name, but with every outside sound he retracted further into himself. Ranbu mentioned something about Phil, but he didn't care. He just needed his brother to let him out of this room, to make the walls stop caving in on him. Yet, he couldn't have that, because his brother was dead. Though, the memories never felt more real. Somehow he had gotten into Phil's car, and he was driving him somewhere. He knew he had something after school, but couldn't recall what it was. The flashes of trees didn't help the numbness behind his eyes. They parked in front of a familiar building. Ah, he had a therapy session. Fitting. He sat on the chair this time, rather than the red bean bag Puffy had bought for him. He needed to sit on something stable, rather than a chair he could sink into. He really felt moments away from passing out, and a beanbag would aid to this. Puffy kept addressing him in various ways, asking him questions, offering him snacks or drinks, telling him things about her day. He couldn't respond, even if he wanted to. But when Wilbur's name left her lips, his attention spiked. Did you end up sorting out that issue you had with Wilbur and that other man he reminded you of? He froze in his seat. Why? Why the fuck did she have to bring that up? He couldn't do this today. He couldn't do this at all. Tommy? He didn't feel like the person sitting in his chair. But he was there, breathing irregularly, keeping the bile from coming up his throat, and failing to keep the memories at bay. The last moments Tommy had with his brother always confused him the most, before he was mercy-killed by his father, by Tantalus, in that exposed hill. After Schlatt's death, his brother handed his presidency to Tobias. He heard Tobias's speech of wanting to create a solid future in L'Manberg, and his condemning of violence and wars, but still blew it to pieces. His brother gave Tommy hope that his insanity and obsession with destroying the land he no longer yearned to reclaim faded from his eyes. But just like everything in Tommy's first life, and the lives that followed, it was ripped from his hopeful hands and twisted into fuel for his nightmares. Tommy doesn't answer Puffy's question, or any of them. An hour of one-sided silence allowed the festering in his head to ponder the inevitability of Wilbur remembering his past lives, his actions, his paranoia and hysteria. Tommy wanted to keep the man who loved the guitar and created stupid Spotify playlists, the foster brother who ruffled his hair and flicked his forehead. He didn't want to see another man lose himself. Puffy ended the session with a concerned sigh, though it fell flat to his ears. The explosions muffled it all. The next day, Tommy felt a bit better. He still had moments where he couldn't catch up to himself, his thoughts providing too much, and whenever he could, he avoided Wilbur like the plague. But after yesterday, Phil forced him to be driven to school, not wanting Tommy to exert himself. I fucked up again, didn't I? Wilbur asked on the car ride to school. Tommy bit on his cheek and directed his eyes ahead. Do you remember what you said to me? No. He answered, distant. The last thing I remember of that night was kicking the shit out of the music player before I started drinking Jaeger bombs. But Techno filled me and said I scared you or something. Tommy clenched his fist into his palm, hoping for his nails to draw blood. Yeah, you did. I don't know what I said, but how do you feel about ravines, Wilbur? He asked, a hiss to his tone. Wilbur spared him a look as he indicated left for the car park. I don't particularly feel anything towards ravines, Wilbur said, yet he sounded uncertain. What about explosives? Tommy insisted. Wilbur parked the car and frowned at him, confused. Tommy, what? Revolutions? Why are you asking me this? Tommy stared into his eyes and searched for another pair that haunted him as he slept. But he couldn't find it. A shade of sweet honey peered back, instead of a dark brown. Wilbur opened his mouth, but Tommy exited the car before he could speak. I'll see you after school, he said as he slammed the door shut. He breathed in the cold air and didn't know if Wilbur's answers lessened or worsened his fears. Either way, it left him unsettled. His last lesson before Easter break was history. He walked in and greeted Tubbo with a fist bump and nodded at Ronbu. Although he felt like a mess, he needed to keep up his appearance, especially for Tubbo, who he still hadn't told about his curse. He now had 7 days to do that, but it irked him to even think about it. As soon as he saw the slip of paper placed on his desk, with the lesson starter printed on it, he knew this lesson was going to be shit. In 50 words or less, explain whether President Tobias was right for exiling Timmy Soot. He glared down at the text and uncapped his pen. He wrote one word and left it there, whilst Ronbu practically wrote an essay, which was more than 50 words, and Tubbo wrote 2 sentences. Miss Allingham asked Tommy to collect everyone's starter slips, and, reluctantly, he got up to do so. He skim-read every single one, alarmed at how many agreed with the statement. He placed them on her desk and returned to his table, dreading what Miss was going to do with the answers. I thought, as it is the last day, we'd start the lesson with a little debate. Oh, for fuck's sake. First, you talk with the people on your table as I go through your answers. Tommy turned to the others and disregarded the look of sympathy on Ronbu's face. He wasn't wearing the face mask for once. Well, I said both yes and no, Tubbo said, since neither Tommy nor Ronbu went to speak. Why, yes? Tommy asked with narrowed eyes. I mean, he did destroy one of King George's houses for no reason. Anger pulsed through him. I was grieving my... Why are you talking in first person, boss man? Tubbo asked, tilting his head. Are you role-playing, L'Manberg? Can I be the one who exiles Timmy? He joked. Ronbu grimaced, and Tommy glared at Tubbo. That's not funny. You don't have to be embarrassed. I used to roleplay South Park. Stop talking. At least Tubbo's mention of his weird South Park roleplay diluted Tommy's growing anger for a moment. But then Miss Allingham started the classroom discussion. He couldn't care less what these fuckers thought about his exile, because it was none of their business. Here they were, debating whether exile was justified for a traumatized 15-year-old, freshly mourning his brother. It was fucked. Now, Tommy, when I said 50 words or less, I didn't mean just one word, Miss Allingham began, bringing the class's attention towards him. Why did you just put no? Tommy's lips thinned as anger fumed under his skin. Because he didn't deserve it, he said. Miss Allingham quirked an eyebrow at him, intrigued. Any arguments to add, or is it only that? His brother had just died. His best friend busied himself with presidency, leaving Timmy alone. Him destroying one of George's properties was just a way for him to get his anger out. He didn't mean to disturb the peace treaty. So, he is excused from the consequences of actions that provoked war just because he was grieving? Miss Allingham said. Even the way she spoke irritated Tommy. It was almost as if, to her, your closest family member violently dying in front of your eyes didn't mean anything. He stayed silent. He didn't want to partake in this, in a discussion over whether the trauma and abuse he faced by the hands of Dream in exile was earned. Can anyone give me an argument defending Tobias? He screwed his eyes shut, and Ronbu brushed his shoulder against him, keeping him from drifting away. Someone raised their hand and answered. Everyone uses the whole Timmy was a child argument to his defense, but what about Tobias? He was only a couple of years older than Timmy and arguably in a worse position. Miss made a noise, encouraging the student to continue. He was inexperienced for the role of president, practically forced into it by W. Soot, and all the other presidents of L'Manberg were bad role models, with how they turned out to be alcoholic dictators and terrorists. He tried his best, and exiling Timmy for threatening peace was the right thing to do. He opened his eyes and leaned closer into Ronbu. He hadn't thought of it like that. But still, he had the right to feel betrayed, even if Tobias had reasons for exiling him, because that was what happened. A betrayal. Nice answer, Miss Allingham said. Now, can you turn to pages 67 to 68 in preparation for the short exam question you'll need to plan out? With his hands shaking, Tommy flickered through his textbook and stopped on the page. He frowned at it. He hadn't seen these diary entries before. He looked at the title, and the cold seeped over him. It was Tobias's diary entries. He had never read these before. He didn't even know Tobias had a diary, or that they were readable after all these years. Are you sure you're all right in this class? Ranbu asked. I can do this. I'll just need to read it and that's it. He whispered, more trying to convince himself than Ranbu. It changes nothing. It's fine. He grabbed his stress ball from his pocket and clutched it in his hand before he started to read the text. Schlatt called me a traitor once, right before he sent a firework straight into my face. Maybe he was right about that all along. Timmy's dead, and I betrayed him. Every day I see those fucking fireworks, the sparks, the burns, everything. But somehow, the glassy eyes of the boy I wronged is the thing that doesn't let me sleep. I should have listened to George's ultimatum. No, I did what I had to do. He threatened our peace period, and if exiling a citizen who provoked conflict was the way to settle this, then I made the right call. He wasn't supposed to die there. He was supposed to come back. I miss him. Tommy stared down at the page, shocked. He expected Tobias to blame him, to maintain the objectivity of a president and hatred for the person who ruined the peace between Nuala Manberg and the SMP Kingdom. But that wasn't it. Tobias regretted it. He didn't brush off his exile like Dream did. He was sorry. The person he believed didn't care when he died seemed to care the most. But this betrayal wasn't just one-sided. Even though he hated to admit it, Tommy had fucked up too. He endangered and almost compromised the peace deal between Nuala Manberg and the SMP Kingdom. He undermined his best friend's presidency and embarrassed the nation he slowly began to lose love for. Tommy may have died without an apology, yet he also died without taking the blame off Tobias. Minutes went by as Tommy continued to reread the passage. He struggled to stop himself from imagining Tobias, alone after the wars, after all those originally in the revolution had died, leaving him alive in a deserted and loveless country. He thought that no one could have ever understood how lonely Tommy felt during exile. But maybe that didn't apply to Tobias. He rubbed at his eyes and sighed. He didn't expect a single history lesson to reconstrue the mentality he had throughout the years since his first death. Admittedly, he believed Tobias to be right with his insults of calling Tommy selfish sometimes, because it had never passed his mind to think of the other perspective, from his side. But now it was too late. You should all be finished planning that question now, Miss Allingham interrupted. Now, another question I want to tackle before Easter break is a small one that won't come up on your GCSE papers, but can be used in other questions. The debate over whether Dream was a real person or a hallucination in Timmy's exile. His face paled. His breathing hastened. No, this is where he drew the line. The sickness in his stomach, the nauseating disdain he had growing inside of him, imploded. Ranbu stood up from beside him. Miss, I need to go to medical. Sit back down, Ranbu. The lesson is almost over. Unless you want me to projectile vomit all over your classroom, then let me go to medical. Ranbu persisted. Fine. Ranbu grabbed Tommy's arm and pulled him up with him. Tommy frowned, his heart still beating too quickly for him to think straight. Tubbo went to join them. Only one other person can go with you to medical. Tubbo sat back down and shared a look with Ranbu before Tommy was pushed out of the room. The bathroom door slammed open, and Tommy rushed over to one of the stalls. He gagged into the toilet seat bowl until the taste of iron left his mouth. Ranbu rubbed his back. He rested his head on the bathroom stall wall. I am so fucking pathetic, he sniffed, his breathing uneven. The feeling of déjà vu hit him. He was in the same position he was 6 months ago, having a breakdown in the school toilets because of a history lesson. I'll never get over what happened in my first life, will I? Ranbu sat beside him, with a face full of worry and care. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met, Tommy. He consoled earnestly. Tommy scoffed and wiped his mouth. Who's the strongest? Tubbo decked me once, he said, and Tommy snorted. How'd he reach you? He had a ladder. Tommy let himself laugh, despite the pitiful situation and heaviness in his head. So I cause a public disturbance in the class to see if you're okay, and it turns out you're talking shit about me? Tubbo bellowed, bursting into the bathroom. How'd you hear us? Ranbu asked, grinning at him as Tubbo stood at the door of the toilet stall. The walls are thin, and my patience for you is thinner, Tubbo threatened. His eyes slit. Ranbu, you better start running, my guy, Tommy added. I'm sure Tubbo won't cause harm to me right now, Ranbu said confidently. Tubbo gave him a look. Okay, he might, but I'm not moving. I'll wait until after school. I appreciate it, Ranbu said, sarcastically. You feeling that sick, boss man? Tubbo asked. Yeah, I'm fine now. Ranbu narrowed his eyes at him, almost as if he could sense the lie. It wasn't technically a lie, though, since he didn't feel the need to throw up anymore. But mentally, he was still a bit fucked. Bullshit, but I'll let it slide, Tubbo conceded. The bell sounded, signaling that school had ended. You want to come round mine? Tubbo asked as he grabbed his phone from his pocket. Tommy shook his head. No, I have something I need to do tonight. All right. I'm going to go home now. I'll see you guys later in the week. Tommy and Ranbu said their goodbyes and watched him leave. Ranbu stayed by his side. I'm thinking of visiting Tobias' statue later, Tommy mumbled. For closure or something. Ranbu nodded at the idea. Leave flowers for him. What? You like flowers, Ranbu? Don't make fun of me whilst you have a flower on your arm. He pointed at Tommy's temporary tattoo. And for your information, alliums are my favorite flower. What do they look like? Ranbu pulled up a photo. Tommy scowled at the purple flower. They look nice, but they have a stupid name. You are so insensitive. He chuckled and accepted Ranbu's hand to get up from the floor. Do you want me to go with you? Ranbu asked. Tommy paused for a moment and stared down at the Zagreus tattoo on his wrist. No, I have someone else in mind. He waited, with the black sky in the park, for Nikki to show up. There was still a dent in the body of Tobias' statue from when he kicked and punched it all those months ago. He didn't recognize the statue in front of him as his childhood best friend, partly because the statue was an older version of Tobias, with one eye missing. The facial features were inaccurate, but the scars on his face weren't. Tommy bit on his lip. It was partly his fault why those scars existed. He didn't interfere when fireworks shot Tobias when he was caged in his own decorations. Tommy stayed on the sidelines with his brother, screaming out in shock. But he did nothing about it. He didn't help his friend. As he picked flowers from the gardens, Nikki joined him. She greeted him with a small hug and a sad smile. He stood facing Tobias, with flowers in his hands and Nikki by his side. She stared at the statue with the same look in her eye, bitterness coated in acceptance. Tommy knew Nikki died in the final L'Manberg War, the one Tobias led. Despite her history with Tobias, she agreed to be here with Tommy, comforting him instead. "I forgive you," he said to her, breaking the gaze from Tobias's bronze face to look at her. "And I hope you forgive me too, Calypso." Her eyes watered. Tommy couldn't deny that he was one of the men who abandoned her, just like her first myth predicted. "I forgave you years ago, Tommy," she said softly, looping their arms together. "We've both wronged each other, but not in this life." Tommy nodded and pulled her closer. He stared back at his childhood friend. "Do you miss him?" he whispered into the cold night. "No," Nikki said shortly, surprising him. "He was cursed as well. I don't know if I already told you." His body stilled. It confused him. He, his brother, his father, Nikki, and now Tobias were cursed. All these people were involved in his first life and the L'Manberg Wars in some way or another, against the SMP Kingdom. It couldn't be a coincidence. "He only showed up once in my void. Then he was reborn and didn't come back," she continued. "He's always been smart, so he probably figured out his myth on the first try." He put his arm around Nikki's shoulder. "I miss him," he murmured, his voice soaked in sorrow. Nikki hugged his side. "I miss him so fucking much." "He missed you too." Nikki rested her head on his shoulder. "You know how your item that survived each rebirth was that notebook, and mine was the necklace?" He nodded. "Tobias's was that scarf you gave him. He had it in the void." Tommy sniffed as his cheeks flushed a deep red. "Of course it fucking was." Nikki hummed, amused. "Is there a reason you wanted to come to visit his statue today?" "A history lesson made me realize some things," he eventually said. "He cared so much for L'Manberg. Even more when I gave up on it. He wanted something permanent and stable, and I was in the way of him achieving that." Nikki stayed quiet as his thoughts muddled together. "It still doesn't excuse how the prick didn't visit me in exile." He chuckled dryly. Something pinched at his heart. Out of everyone left alive, him visiting would have meant the most. A tear slipped down his face. "If you could say something to him and he'd hear, what would you say?" Nikki asked. "That I didn't deserve to be exiled," he said, his eyes focused on Tobias's scars and a motionless face. "But he didn't deserve to be alone either." The two remained in silence, the cold winds swaying their bodies as they stood staring at the statue that meant more to Tommy than it ever did before. Tommy gently placed the flowers at the foot of Tobias's statue, hoping that whatever afterlife dream permitted for him was merciful.